There are parts of New York City that do not announce themselves. They do not have plaques or guided tours or commemorative dates. They exist as engineering decisions made under pressure, then reclassified as liabilities, then slowly absorbed into the background noise of a city that forgets by continuing to move. The subway is the city's most honest archive because it keeps what was built even when it can no longer be used. Above ground, buildings are raised and replaced in a generation. Underground, the cost of demolition is so high that abandonment becomes a policy. The result is not emptiness, but quiet occupation, sealed platforms, dead-end bell mouths, unused lower levels, loop tracks that exist for trains and not for people. In that layered space, the city has preserved its fears. In the early Cold War, New York did what every target city did. It planned, not with certainty, but with administrative persistence. The language of civil defense moved into municipal budgets and transportation diagrams. Federal reluctance to fund large urban shelters produced an uneasy improvisation. Basements, deep stations, and existing underground infrastructure became the default refuge in public imagination, even when engineers knew the limits of that idea. The gap between what a subway can endure and what officials implied it might endure became a kind of bark shelter of its own, psychological, not structural. And so the story begins not with one tunnel, but with a pattern. New York repeatedly built spaces meant for a future emergency, then left them behind as the future changed shape. One of the most visible ghosts sits beneath City Hall, a station designed as ceremony. Opened with the first IRT subway in 1904, it was an architectural statement of permanence. It was also, in a practical sense, a dead end, a curved terminal that became inconvenient as trains grew longer and schedules tightened. By December 31, 1945, it was closed to passengers, left as an unused platform on an active loop track, visible only in passing to those who know where to look. The station still exists in a controlled kind of afterlife, acknowledged by the New York Transit Museum as a beginning point of the system and a relic that cannot be returned to public use without cost and disruption. The images of City Hall Station tend to mislead people. They show chandeliers, skylights, and vaulted tile, beauty that reads as nostalgia. But the horror in that space is not aesthetic. It is the fact that the loop track still carries trains, that the station is still physically there, and yet the public is no longer part of it. The same air that keeps the active line ventilated passes through a room that was designed to welcome crowds, now maintained only to the degree necessary to keep it from becoming a hazard. In the Cold War years, New York's underground was studied not for ornament, but for survivability, depth, distance from blast, the ability to seal off sections, the possibility of moving people or officials through the city when surface streets were compromised. The most alluring idea was not to protect the whole population, which was never realistic, but to preserve continuity, a city that could keep functioning, a government that could keep issuing orders. That is where the concept of a Doomsday subway begins, not as a single designated bunker line, but as a collection of rail spaces and tunnel projects that could be repurposed in theory and were quietly evaluated in practice. In the 1960s and 1970s, New York planned and partially built infrastructure with a particular kind of redundancy, tunnels and station shells that anticipated expansions decades away. Some of that redundancy was ordinary, future service patterns, expected population shifts. Some of it was shaped by a national obsession with continuity in catastrophe. In that era, building something for the future often meant building something for a future nobody could clearly describe. Those projects left cavities in the city, spaces made to be used later, then left to age instead. The 63rd Street Tunnel is one of the clearest examples of that logic. Bored under the East River, connecting Manhattan and Queens, it was envisioned as more than a subway passage. The complex included multiple levels, including a lower level intended for Long Island Railroad service. In the end, the tunnel became famous for a different reason. It was referred to as a tunnel to nowhere because its Queens end did not connect to any other subway line for years, leaving expensive infrastructure underutilized and partially unused. The lower level, built with future intentions, remained dormant even longer. To understand the unease such places create, it helps to imagine their most basic condition. They are engineered, powered, and mapped, yet they are not lived in. A normal station has human noise that masks mechanical noise. An unused tunnel has only mechanical noise, and that noise is not continuous. It comes in pulses, fans starting, pumps cycling, relays clicking, distant trains pressurizing air in adjacent tubes. The system speaks to itself in intervals. A person who stands long enough in one of these spaces begins to notice patterns that feel like intention. Most of the time, they are simply maintenance schedules. This is where the abandoned Doomsday subway becomes more than a rumor. It is not one secret line with a cinematic name. It is the accumulation of half-finished plans, sealed-off construction, and infrastructure built to a standard higher than the public ever needed because planners feared a scenario in which public need would no longer matter. There is another element that completes the picture: the habit of tunneling for purposes other than passengers. New York's underground includes mail tunnels, utility corridors, and service connections that were never meant to be seen. The Farley Morgan Postal Tunnel is a small example, an obscure tunnel under 9th Avenue connecting the Farley Post Office to the Morgan Mail Sorting Facility, described in urban exploration accounts as a little-known passage that sat in abandonment for long stretches of time. These non-passenger tunnels matter because they show how easily the city builds hidden routes when the function is considered essential. Mail, power, water, communications, systems that must keep moving even when the surface is blocked. In the Cold War mindset, that essential category expanded to include government itself. Somewhere in that expansion, projects were proposed and partially executed that left behind physical evidence but incomplete public explanation. New York has a long tradition of that kind of absence. The 76th Street Station legend, tied to unbuilt or sealed segments near Pitkin Avenue in Queens, exists in the public record as a disputed story, a mystery maintained by contradictory documents and the simple fact that sealed tunnels do exist and can be mistaken for more than they are. Over time, such mysteries become narrative containers. People pour their anxieties into them. Hidden platforms, sealed staircases, stations erased from maps. The Doomsday subway story uses the same container, but with higher stakes. It says that somewhere beneath New York, there is a purpose-built refuge line, an abandoned stretch designed not just for transit, but for survival in nuclear war. It says it was engineered to keep officials moving, sealed and pressurized, with independent power, with doors that could close against ash and smoke. It says it was abandoned not because it was unnecessary, but because it was flawed. The documentary record does not give us a single clean object labeled that way. What it gives us is something more credible and, in the end, more disturbing. A system that already contains the necessary parts. Deep stations, loops, bell mouths aimed at futures that never arrived. Lower levels built and left quiet. Service corridors not meant for the public. Ventilation and pumping that can be isolated by section. A workforce trained to treat darkness as routine. And then, around those parts, it gives us the administrative habit of sealing. In New York, sealed does not mean removed. It means placed under a different form of control. A wall of cinder block, a locked steel door, a maintenance hatch without signage. These are not dramatic barriers. They are ordinary. They are how the city keeps its abandoned spaces from becoming public space. By the late 1970s, as fiscal crisis and deferred maintenance reshaped New York, the idea of building for catastrophe narrowed into the more immediate catastrophe of daily operation. The subway had to survive the present. The future shelters embedded in its plans became harder to justify, and yet they were still there, aging in parallel with the active system. When Hurricane Sandy flooded New York's underground in October 2012, it revealed how fragile that parallel existence is. Water does not respect the boundary between active and inactive space. It migrates through low points, cable conduits, and forgotten penetrations. In accounts of Sandy's flooding, the first recognition was often sensory, people realizing the underground was taking on water before instruments confirmed it. That matters to this story because the Doomsday subway, if it ever existed as a coherent refuge, would have depended on a belief that certain sections could be protected, sealed, pumped, kept dry, kept breathable. Sandy demonstrated the opposite. The underground is one connected body. When it takes damage, it takes it everywhere.
There is a particular kind of unease that comes from infrastructure built to withstand war, being compromised by water. Nuclear war is an abstract fear, distant and theoretical. Water is immediate. It fills a space silently until it begins to move objects. It carries oil, silt, and electrical risk into places designed to be controlled. It turns a tunnel into a container. The closer we look at New York's abandoned subway spaces, the more we see that the horror is not in a hidden dramatic chamber. It is in the fact that the city has so many places it cannot afford to fully understand anymore. It maintains them as best it can. It seals them, it forgets them, it keeps running trains past them. And in the background of all this is the simplest fact. An underground system built to move millions every day can also move something else: panic, smoke, heat, floodwater, at a scale that cannot be negotiated with once it begins. What follows is not a hunt for a single mythical bunker line. It is an investigation into how New York built survivability into its subway without ever admitting the limits of that survivability, and how the spaces left behind, lower levels, sealed platforms, incomplete tunnels, became a quiet record of what the city feared most. In engineering, there is a difference between can and will. A tunnel can be sealed. Whether it will seal when it matters is another question. New York's subway was not built as a bunker system in the way certain Cold War metros were. It was built as a transit machine, porous, ventilated, constantly exchanging air with the surface, dependent on power distribution and human labor. The city's later tendency to imagine it as a shelter was always conditional. Condition is a word that appears often in internal audits and maintenance reports. Condition of stairs, condition of emergency exits, condition of lighting and wiring. In the public mind, the subway is a single system. In practice, it is an accumulation of systems: track, signal, third rail power, ventilation, pumping, communications, each with its own failure modes, each capable of turning a refuge into a trap if it degrades. Even in normal times, the system carries lethal energy. The third rail is the most obvious example, a constant electrical source designed to be close to ground level, close to human beings, made safe only by policy, barriers, and procedure. A doomsday line, if one was seriously contemplated, would have required a different set of assumptions: independent power, simplified signaling, protected ventilation, redundant pumping, and strict control of access. The difficulty is that many of the components already existed in fragments. New York's underground is full of rooms and corridors that were built not for passengers, but for control. Signal relay rooms, fan plants, pump rooms, cable vaults. These spaces are sometimes adjacent to abandoned platforms or unused lower levels, and sometimes they are the only reason those spaces remain maintained at all.
A closed station like City Hall illustrates this uneasy half-life. It is not merely locked. It is preserved enough to not harm the active loop track that passes it. That means structural inspections, water and filtration control, and the maintenance of clearances. The station is unused only in the way a disused organ can remain in a body, still connected by blood vessels. Now, scale that to the larger, less visible spaces: bell mouths, sealed tunnel stubs, and lower levels designed for service that never arrived. The 63rd Street project is instructive because it demonstrates how New York built future capacity into its tunnels as physical fact. The lower level, intended for LIRR service, was completed as part of the tunnel complex, even as the politics and financing of such service shifted. Engineers had to build it then because it would be too expensive later. The result was a void, a finished structure without a public function, aging in the same groundwater and vibration field as everything around it. Voids attract stories. It is a predictable human response. But the most unsettling aspect of these places is that they do not need embellishment. They are already the physical form of a promise that could not be kept. When civil defense planners looked at the subway as potential shelter, they were often thinking in terms of fallout, not direct blast. That distinction matters. A deep station might offer shielding from radiation in the aftermath of a distant detonation, but it was not meant to support long-term habitation. Water, sanitation, food, medical care, crowd control, none of those requirements are satisfied by a transit station. Ventilation becomes a liability. The subway's air handling is designed to move heat and fumes away, not to filter radioactive particulates or chemical contaminants. A shelter that pulls outside air in is a shelter only until outside air becomes dangerous. The reason the Doomsday subway story persists is that some parts of New York's underground were built with unusually robust features: heavy doors, deep shafts, secured corridors. But these features often have banal explanations. They are meant to isolate fires, limit smoke migration, protect staff spaces, or secure critical equipment. In a crisis, those same features could be interpreted as defensive architecture. The boundary between defensive design and operational design is thin underground. A thick steel door is simply a thick steel door until someone decides it was meant to keep something out. The most convincing version of the Doomsday subway is not a passenger line. It is a protected route, a way to move a small number of people, officials, essential staff, between key nodes without surface exposure. Such routes would not need stations with mosaics. They would need service platforms, freight corridors, interlocks, and access to rail yards. They would also need connections to buildings that matter. This is where the city's other hidden tunnels become relevant again. The Farley-Morgan Postal Tunnel, for example, existed for logistics, not transit. It was 1 block long, under 9th Avenue, connecting a major post office to a mail sorting facility. It demonstrates that New York routinely built underground connections when the function was considered critical enough. Once you accept that premise, it is not difficult to imagine a Cold War planner looking at the rail network as a chassis for continuity. The difficulty is not conceptual, it is mechanical. New York's subway is hostile to prolonged stillness. A train in motion is a ventilation system. It pushes air, it equalizes pockets. When trains stop, the system changes. Heat accumulates, humidity condenses, mold begins, rats relocate. Electrical rooms become more vulnerable to corrosion. Pumps that run continuously become the only thing separating a tunnel from groundwater. This is true in active parts. In inactive parts, it becomes more pronounced because the human presence that notices small changes is reduced. Flooding is the simplest demonstration of how quickly a tunnel can become uninhabitable. Heavy rains have flooded the subway before, and Hurricane Sandy demonstrated storm surge penetration into commuter tunnels and subway infrastructure on a scale that overwhelmed normal pumping strategies. In Vanity Fair, water moves through the system along gradients and openings that were never meant to be hydrological pathways. It also transports contaminants, oil from track beds, brake dust, sewage intrusion from combined systems, and the fine metallic residue of decades of operation. If you are building a refuge, you must assume the worst possible contamination scenario. Subway tunnels, by design, are not cleanable in that sense. They can be repaired, they can be dewatered, but they cannot be sterilized quickly, and they cannot be relied upon for respiratory safety without a controlled air system that New York subway does not have. Even if a segment was built with better sealing and protected ventilation, it would still have to connect to the rest of the system somewhere. That connection is a weakness. Every interlock is a point where the refuge becomes dependent on adjacent conditions. Every cable penetration is a potential leak path for water or smoke. Every ventilation shaft is a vertical vulnerability. This is why the most disturbing part of the Doomsday subway story is not the claim that it was built. The disturbing part is that it would have been almost impossible to make it work as imagined, and that the city may have proceeded anyway, leaving behind a structure that embodies a failed attempt at survival planning. There are also overlooked human limitations. A shelter is not just concrete, it is management. New York subway was built to distribute crowds, not hold them. Platforms are sized for flow. Stairways and mezzanines are sized for turnover. In a panic scenario, those same geometries produce choke points. A deep station that is safe in radiation terms can become lethal if tens of thousands try to enter at once, or if power fails and escalators stop. Darkness in a subway is not a poetic darkness. It is immediate and physical. It turns edges into hazards. The technical warnings are embedded in the system's history. The City Hall station was closed because it could not accommodate longer trains and because its proximity to Brooklyn Bridge made it redundant. That is a mundane operational decision, but it reveals the broader truth. The subway changes as trains, ridership, and needs change. A bunker concept does not adapt so easily. A bunker is defined by its fixed purpose. When the system evolves, the bunker becomes misfit. The 63rd Street Tunnel's period of underuse, its tunnel-to-nowhere reputation, shows another kind of warning. Infrastructure can be technically complete and still functionally absent. A Doomsday segment could be built, documented, and then quietly set aside as budgets shifted, threats changed, or the engineering proved too compromised. It could become a space that exists on paper and in concrete, but not in public memory. That absence is where strange patterns are reported. People notice sealed doors in active stations. Maintenance workers talk about areas they do not enter unless assigned. Train operators see dark platforms through gaps at speed. The stories are usually fragmented because the system is compartmentalized. A signal maintainer knows signal rooms. A track worker knows bench walls and third rail. A station agent knows mezzanines and fare control. Few people know the whole. In that compartmentalization, a pattern can form without anyone intending it. Small anomalies accumulate, an access point that appears on a plan but is welded shut, a ventilation fan that cycles at odd hours, a persistent dampness behind a wall, an unused conduit that still carries a humming load. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires only age, complexity, and a city that cannot afford to look closely at everything it owns. By the time we reach the late Cold War and post-Cold War period, the subway has accumulated layers of abandonment that overlap with layers of ongoing operation. Some mysteries, like the disputed 76th Street station, persist precisely because the system contains enough sealed spaces to make any specific claim plausible. Columbia University, if a Doomsday subway was ever attempted, its remains would be indistinguishable from other remains unless someone could connect them to a specific design brief. Hardened doors, protected air handling, and a deliberate route between key nodes. That connection is what investigators have looked for, not a dramatic bunker, but a corridor of intent. The problem is that intent is often the first thing to disappear when a project is discontinued. Concrete stays, paper gets refiled, names change, agencies reorganize. A tunnel becomes, in the record, a provision. A lower level becomes future use. A sealed platform becomes out of service. These phrases are neutral. They are designed to prevent attention because attention creates demands. In the next part, the story moves from design logic and technical limits into the period when the system's hidden spaces began to intersect with real incidents: floods, fires, power failures, unauthorized entries, and the kind of operational confusion that is only possible in a system with so many forgotten rooms. The darkest periods in infrastructure are not the moments of collapse. They are the periods of partial function, when the system still runs but its margins have narrowed, and when a failure in one compartment begins to trigger failures elsewhere. New York's subway has lived in that condition for decades. The city has endured fiscal crises, deferred maintenance, extreme weather, and the slow stress of constant use. In that environment, abandoned spaces do not remain sealed in the way people imagine. They are breached by necessity. They are entered for inspections, for cable pulls, for drainage work, for emergency reroutes. Each entry creates new knowledge for a small number of people and new ignorance for everyone else, because what is learned is rarely translated into public narrative. There is a particular kind of incident that recurs in the history of large underground systems. A minor event becomes serious because it happens in the wrong place, near a relay room, near a ventilation plant, near a junction where smoke can migrate. In 2005, reporting on subway signal room hazards referenced internal findings that smoke detectors and fire retardant material should be installed at relay rooms after a blaze in 1999. That kind of recommendation is routine in the language of safety, but it implies something broader. The system contains critical chambers where fire is not just a fire, it is a potential shutdown of control. A Doomsday segment, if it existed, would have had to be attached to those control systems. It would have relied on them. That reliance is itself a vulnerability, because control rooms are rarely designed as bunkers. They are designed for access, maintenance, and wiring density. They are filled with combustible cable insulation, dust, and the accumulated residue of decades of operation. They are often hot because equipment generates heat, and ventilation is imperfect. The hidden spaces of the subway are therefore not empty. They are loaded, electrically, mechanically, chemically. The air in an abandoned platform is not fresh. It carries brake dust, iron particles, and the faint, sharp smell of ozone from electrical arcing. Dampness amplifies odors. Still air preserves them. A person can mistake that preservation for presence, as if something has remained waiting. The incidents that push these spaces into visibility are often water-related. Water is not a dramatic intruder at first, it is a slow compromise. It corrodes bolts, it swells concrete, it produces efflorescence that looks like white frost on tunnel walls. And then, under the right conditions, it becomes sudden, a surge, a main break, a storm event. After Hurricane Sandy on October 29, 2012, the flooding of New York's underground became an event of record, described not only as physical inundation, but as a psychological shock, the realization that the city's hidden world could be filled end to end. Flooding does something specific to abandoned spaces. It erases the practical boundary between in-service and out-of-service. A sealed tunnel stub that has been dry for years can become a reservoir. A lower level can collect water and hold it behind walls that were never designed as dams. A pump room can become inaccessible at the moment it is most needed because the approach corridor is underwater. In an active station, a flood is seen and responded to. In a sealed space, it can develop unnoticed until it begins to affect adjacent active areas through seepage, electrical faults, or structural stress. This is where accounts become disturbing in a way that is difficult to document publicly. The system's workers see effects before the public does. They see discoloration spreading on walls. They hear changes in the sound of fans. They notice when an area that is usually dry has standing water. They also learn which doors remain locked and which doors, for operational reasons, cannot remain fully locked. In the years after Sandy, resilience became an official topic: how to protect tunnels, stations, and equipment from water. But resilience is not retroactive. The abandoned spaces that already existed became harder to evaluate because many of them were never designed with modern flood assumptions, and many of them were never meant to be occupied long-term. The more water events occurred, the more those spaces became less like rooms and more like evolving geological features. The Doomsday subway story, in its most credible form, intersects here. If a hardened refuge route existed, Sandy would have tested it in the most basic way, not against blast, but against infiltration. Water is a kind of proof. It shows where seals fail, where conduits act as channels, where walls are not truly walls. It shows where the underground is one body. The tunnel to nowhere period of the 63rd Street Tunnel offers another kind of escalation. Prolonged underuse creates a space that is technically complete, but socially absent. Such spaces become convenient for storage, for staging, for temporary access. They also become tempting for unauthorized entry. Every major transit system contends with trespassers and explorers. New York is no exception. Sealed doors are interpreted as invitations. The danger is not only the third rail, but the fact that the system contains blind curves, low clearances, and sections where the only warning of an oncoming train is a vibration that arrives too late. The public often thinks of the third rail as a single hazard: touch it and it kills. The reality is more complex and therefore more frightening. In a dark tunnel, a person can be killed by proximity without direct contact if they become the path between energized components and ground. Water increases conductivity. Metal surfaces accumulate residue. A tool dropped in the wrong place can become an arc source. These hazards are why track access is governed by procedure, why power is shut off in controlled ways, and why emergency exits and egress paths matter. In abandoned areas, procedure becomes thinner. Work is less frequent. Familiarity is lower. That is when small mistakes become fatal mistakes. There are also incidents of misrouting, human error amplified by complexity. In a system with multiple interlocks, yard leads, and unused stubs, a wrong alignment can send a work train or maintenance equipment into a place not intended for it. Most such errors are corrected without consequence. The public rarely hears of them because the system is built to absorb error. But the absorption has limits. A wrong move into a flooded stub, a low clearance segment, or a section with degraded track bed can trap equipment and personnel, forcing improvised rescues in spaces that were never designed for routine access. It is in this zone, between normal operation and crisis, that disturbing accounts tend to cluster. They are not supernatural. They are often about sound and disorientation, a fan plant starting unexpectedly, the way a sealed corridor can amplify footsteps until they no longer sound like the person making them, the way radio communication becomes unreliable in certain alignments, the way a flashlight beam reveals reflective eyes far down a tunnel, then reveals nothing at all when you move closer. There is also the psychological pressure of working in spaces that the public does not know exist. It creates a form of isolation that is distinct from ordinary underground work. A track worker on an active line knows that trains will come, that other crews are nearby, that the system is awake. In a sealed, unused lower level, the system feels asleep. The air is heavier. The silence is not absolute, but it is intermittent. That intermittency can be worse than noise because it denies rhythm. People begin to measure time by drip patterns, by fan cycles, by the distant pressure wave of trains in neighboring tubes.
And then there are the records. In New York, records are not always lost, they are redistributed. Plans move between agencies. Old designations persist in internal documents long after the public names have changed. A space that was once part of a grand plan can become a footnote in a binder labeled provisions. That is the administrative form of abandonment, not erasure, but reduction. The 76th Street Station story shows how such reduction becomes fertile ground for legend. It sits in the public imagination as a hidden station that may or may not exist, supported by the undeniable fact that sealed tunnels and unused segments do exist, and that documentation can be incomplete or misleading. Columbia University, the Doomsday subway story, attaches itself to that uncertainty because a bunker line would have been, by necessity, poorly advertised. But secrecy is not the only reason such a project would become obscure. A more plausible reason is embarrassment, a system built to survive nuclear war that could not withstand water infiltration, power dependency, or ventilation vulnerability would be a failure of imagination made concrete. It would be easier to stop talking about it than to admit its limits. In the late Cold War era, as the perceived nuclear threat shifted and budgets tightened, the system's focus moved toward keeping daily service running. The abandoned spaces remained as liabilities, structural voids that could collect water, fire load, or unauthorized people. Sealing became more aggressive, walls went up, doors were welded, access points were decommissioned. Yet every barrier in a system that must be maintained includes an exception. Someone somewhere keeps a key. Someone somewhere keeps a map. The darkest period of the Doomsday subway story, as it is spoken of among those who have tried to trace it, is not a single night or a single disaster. It is a stretch of years in which the system's hidden compartments were repeatedly tested by real-world stress, storms, fires, aging equipment, and in which the idea of survivability collapsed quietly, not in public, but in internal choices. A decision not to fund a particular retrofit, a decision to decommission a ventilation plant rather than rebuild it, a decision to reclassify a route segment as storage. In the next part, the story moves into the aftermath, how these spaces were folded into silence, how records became harder to access, and how an abandoned refuge concept leaves a lasting psychological presence, precisely because it cannot be conclusively proven or disproven by those who live above it. After an infrastructure failure, there's a period that feels like recovery but is closer to triage. New York subway has lived through multiple such periods, and each one leaves behind a residue of decisions that are not announced. A tunnel is repaired, a station is renovated, a door is welded shut, a plan is updated and distributed internally. The public sees the return of service and assumes the rest is resolved. Underground resolution is rarely complete. It is rebalanced. When Hurricane Sandy flooded the system, the visible story was water and restoration. The less visible story was what the flooding did to the places that were already marginal. Sealed stubs, unused lower levels, tunnels that were technically part of the network but socially absent. Water exposure changes concrete slowly, but it changes electrical systems immediately. It deposits salt. It corrodes connectors. It makes cable insulation brittle. It introduces long-term failure into spaces that will be entered only intermittently, sometimes years later, when the damage has already become part of the environment. In the logic of an abandoned doomsday subway, this is where the concept would die, not in a dramatic decision, but in the slow recognition that certain assumptions cannot be made true. You cannot seal a system that was designed to breathe. You cannot promise a refuge when your most basic vulnerabilities are shared across compartments. You cannot claim independence when your power distribution is integrated with a city grid that may not exist in the scenario you are preparing for. And so, if such a project ever existed as a coherent route or segment, the most likely ending is administrative silence, a line item removed, a retrofit postponed indefinitely, a set of keys returned to a central office, then redistributed, then misplaced in the sense that matters, no longer held by anyone who remembers why they exist. That kind of forgetting is not accidental. Large organizations forget by necessity. A transit authority cannot afford to preserve every old intention. It preserves what it must to keep operating. Everything else becomes background. The City Hall station is often presented as the subway's most famous abandoned space. It is visible in photographs and museum narratives, a sealed jewel that still sits beside an active loop. But its fame is misleading. It is not representative of the deeper abandonment. It is a controlled relic. The true abandoned spaces are not beautiful. They are serviceable voids, places with peeling paint, damaged tiles, conduit runs that end in nothing, and the persistent damp that indicates the city's water is still trying to enter. The 63rd Street Tunnel's long underused period and the existence of its lower-level provisions illustrate how such voids can persist for decades. A tunnel can be bored, lined, and equipped, then left underutilized because political and financial conditions changed. The concrete does not care why it was abandoned. It will continue to age, and the city will continue to pay for the minimum level of care required to prevent it from becoming a catastrophe. Minimal care is a cold concept. It implies that safety is a threshold, not a goal. The MTA Inspector General's language about emergency exits and defects, tripping hazards, inadequate lighting, exposed wires, reflects how much of subway safety depends on continuous attention. In abandoned spaces, continuous attention is not possible. The threshold is maintained until the threshold moves. This is the condition that produces the lasting psychological presence of the abandoned Doomsday subway. It is not a haunting in the supernatural sense. It is a structural fact. There are places beneath New York that were built with purpose, then deprived of purpose, then kept from collapsing only by minimal maintenance and the inertia of concrete.
People who work underground often describe a particular kind of fatigue that is not physical. It comes from the awareness that the system is bigger than any map they are allowed to see at one time. It comes from knowing that there are doors they cannot open, corridors they cannot enter, and that these limitations are not always about security. Sometimes they are about liability. Sometimes they are about fear. Fear that if the wrong space becomes visible, questions will be asked that cannot be answered without exposing years of neglect or incomplete planning. The myths that grow around places like the alleged 76th Street station demonstrate how uncertainty becomes permanent. The Columbia University Abandoned Stations Archive treats 76th Street explicitly as a kind of cautionary tale about rumor, documentation, and the way subway lore persists in the absence of clear evidence. Whether or not that station exists as described, the story reveals something important. The system is credible enough as a labyrinth that the public will accept almost any claim, and the authorities' natural response, silence, only increases belief. A Doomsday subway story thrives in that environment because it sounds like the kind of thing governments would quietly prepare and quietly bury. The problem is that the subway itself is already quiet proof of how the city thinks in emergencies. Not through secrecy alone, but through redundancy. Build extra space, build future provisions, keep options open. The abandoned spaces are the fossil record of those options. The other hidden tunnels, like the Farley-Morgan Postal Tunnel, remind us that New York's underground has always been used for continuity in a broader sense, keeping essential flows moving beneath the surface. That continuity is never romantic. It is functional. It is also indifferent. The tunnel does not care who uses it. It can be mail one decade, a conduit route another, and in abandonment it becomes something else, a place where time accumulates without witnesses. The lasting presence of the Doomsday subway, then, is not a specific sealed platform with hardened doors and emergency supplies stacked neatly. It is the implication that such a place could have been attempted and that the attempt could have failed quietly, leaving behind a structure that is neither fully part of the active system nor fully separate from it. Because the subway is one body, nothing is truly separate. Air moves, water moves, noise moves. A sealed station still experiences vibration from trains. A sealed tunnel still responds to pressure changes. A dead-end bell mouth still collects dust, driven by airflow that has no reason to stop. In that sense, the abandoned places are not dead, they are simply unobserved. There is an image that often accompanies discussions of City Hall Station, a bright chandelier hanging above an empty platform, ornate tilework intact, the space appearing preserved. The disturbing truth is that the city contains far more spaces that look nothing like that. Spaces where water has marked the walls in uneven lines. Spaces where wires hang in bundles like roots. Spaces where signage was never installed because the public was never meant to arrive. Spaces that were built as future, then became never, and are now simply there. The psychological effect on the city above is subtle. Most people never think about the tunnels beneath their feet, unless a train is delayed or a flood appears on the news. But the subway shapes New York's sense of vulnerability. It is the place people descend into for routine, and in certain eras, it has been framed as the place they might descend into for protection. That framing does not disappear just because experts question it. It remains as cultural reflex. Go underground, you will be safer.
The Gothamist reporting on deep stations as potential nuclear shelters makes clear that this reflex still exists, even now, and that experts quickly point out limitations. Tunnels could become dangerous, ventilation could draw in contaminants, and the reality of sheltering is more complex than depth alone. The gap between reflex and reality is where fear lives in modern cities. Not in monsters, but in miscalculation. If there was an abandoned Doomsday subway in New York, its true darkness would be this. It would represent a moment when planners tried to transform a transit machine into a survival machine without fully respecting what makes the subway work. The subway works because it is open, ventilated, powered, and staffed. It survives because it is constantly maintained. In catastrophe, the very qualities that make it function, air exchange, connectivity, dependence on power and people, can become liabilities. In the end, the most realistic horror is not that the city built a hidden refuge and abandoned it. It is that the city built the physical shape of refuge in pieces through future provisions, redundant tunnels, sealed platforms, and then allowed those pieces to persist without the supporting systems that would make refuge possible. The abandoned spaces remain as quiet evidence of planning that could not be completed and of vulnerability that cannot be sealed away. New York continues to run trains past locked doors. It continues to pump water out of low points. It continues to ventilate tunnels that include spaces the public will never see. The system remains an archive, not only of transit history, but of the city's changing relationship with disaster, what it feared, what it prepared for, what it could not afford to finish. And beneath all of that is the simplest, most permanent fact. The underground is patient. It does not erase mistakes quickly. It keeps them, poured into concrete, bolted into steel, routed in cable trays, and it waits for the moment when the city's attention shifts again, when a storm, a fire, or a power failure forces someone to open a door that has been closed for years and confront what has been quietly evolving behind it. If you want, I can also provide a separate list of the real-world locations and infrastructure elements referenced, stations, tunnels, and key claims, with source links only, so you can verify every anchor point before production.